Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Darylyn and today I wanted to talk a little bit about growing plants in pond. Now, I have been using pond for a little over a year now, and I don't know what it is about the anniversary of things that can sometimes make one reflect back on the journey. So I thought that it would be a good time to kind of maybe sum up all of the things that I've learned about using pond, the pros and the cons, not only whether do I recommend it, but also how I recommend using it and how to incorporate using pond into your plant care if that's something that you're interested in doing. So the first thing that you should be aware of when you're getting started first putting a plant into pond is the state of the health of the plant's roots. I don't really recommend putting unrooted cuttings or plants that are fresh from import straight into pond. I definitely find that the best results that you're going to get using hydroponics and pond in general is with plants that already have really healthy established roots. Now, you do have some flexibility with how you propagate your roots before you put your plant into pond. I find that it works really well to propagate and have the plants form water roots and then transfer them into pond, but it also works just as well to transfer plants from moss into pond and soil into pond as well. One of the things about pond that I really like and prefer over leca is that you have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to how clean your roots are. With leca, it's really important to get every single speck of other substrate off before putting into leca, and a lot of times you do need to reroot your plant completely before you put it into leca. With pond, you have a lot more flexibility, and I've transferred tons and tons of plants from moss specifically, but also soil into pond and had really no issues. So that is one of the nice things about pond. It's very flexible as far as transitioning your plant over. And fortunately, you don't really have to worry too much about root damage when moving plants over into pond. Another thing to keep in mind when you are getting started in pond is that it's really important to rinse the pond as thoroughly as possible and then continue to flush it for a little while after you first put the plant into the new medium as well. Pond is essentially a mix of very finely ground rocks. As a result, in the packaging, there is quite a bit of rock dust. If you don't flush your pond, these finely ground rock particulates tend to accumulate in the bottom of your self-watering reservoir or at the bottom of your pot, and it can cause issues for your roots, not getting enough aeration. One of the key benefits of pond really is the fact that the air pockets in between all of the different rock granules really provide a lot of aeration for the roots. And so this dust accumulating at the bottom of the pot really defeats the purpose. So it's extremely important that you rinse your pond thoroughly before you put your plant into it for the first time. And then also that you continue to flush the pond semi-regularly for the first couple of months that you have the plant in the pond. What I prefer to do is run water through the pond until I have water coming out the bottom that is clear and I don't see any more finely ground particulates coming out the bottom. I find that extra flushing of the pond for the first couple of months that the plant is in the new substrate helps reduce the amount of acclimation damage that I get on my leaves. Some plants, when they're newly acclimating to pond, will start to show some acclimation damage in the leaves that it kind of looks similar to a bacterial or a fungal spot, and there can sometimes be some yellowing or some cracking. Usually when you see that, that's an indication that you've waited too long to flush the pond. And once you flush the pond again, a lot of times the damage will dry out and you won't see it restart unless you wait too long again. Something else to consider when you first move your plant over to a pond setup with hydroponics is that you are going to have to top water your plant for a little while before the plant grows roots down into the part of the pot where it's always going to be wet and has adapted for those roots to always be accessing water. However, after a while, when your plant is fully established, you are going to want to only water it through the vent in your self-watering pot. This is going to help prevent your plant taking up too much water and being blocked off from enjoying the benefits of the air pockets in the pond. And being sure to water only through the vent in the self-watering pot is going to help prevent the leaf from uptaking moisture and trying to release it through the leaves. And it will help in general with your overall leaf health through the life of the plant in the pond substrate. Once you've got your plant set up and established in pond, keep in mind that although you should start to see really amazing results after a while, it's not an overnight miracle, and the plant is going to take some time to establish some roots before it starts to push lots of leaves. I personally have had really good experience with the plants adapting really quickly, especially if they already have roots, and pushing leaves quickly. But you can also have instances where the plant takes several months to fully establish itself before it starts to push a leaf. The one nice thing about plants taking a while to establish themselves in pond is that if they are a bit slow to push more foliage, when they do eventually push new leaves, they tend to be quite a bit larger, which is always a really, really exciting surprise. Another thing that can be a little bit challenging or a little bit daunting if you are new to semi-hydro is the idea of pH balancing and monitoring and managing the pH of the water that is interacting in your system. So if you are able to get your hands on the genuine lechuza pond that is actually made by the company, it is a little bit easier. They do purport that their product does have the ability to manage pH for you. I, however, do prefer to take it a step further, especially for my aroids, my philodendrons, and my anthurium, and I give all of my plants a pH balanced water formulation that also has nutrients. Genuine lechuza pond also has a slow release fertilizer in it, but I do find that anthurium especially are heavy enough feeders that they can actually thrive quite well off of the slow release fertilizer in the lechuza pond, in addition to the water formulation that I give to my plants. I find that what has worked best for me is water that is at least filtered. The cleaner the water, the better. You want to make sure that you are filtering out any chemicals like fluoride, chlorine, etc. that can be present in tap water. Many aroids really don't do too well with those chemicals in their water supply, and one of the main things that I've found for good anthurium health and especially longevity of leaves is water quality. So with lechuza pond, because it is hydroponics, this is especially important. My personal process for the water I give my plants in pond and semi-hydro is I use water that has been filtered from my Brita filter. I then add some vitamins and fertilizer booster. In my case, I use Super Thrive as directed, and then I also use Liquid Dirt as directed. And then I use a half strength orchid fertilizer. And in my case, I use MSU orchid fertilizer that's formulated for tap water. Then on top of that, I use the semi-hydroponics pH balanced drop system in order to make sure that I can keep the pH of my water between 5.5 and 6.5, which is slightly acidic, which is generally the preference that a lot of aroids have for their water acidity. Personally, so far, I have found that keeping plants in semi-hydro, particularly anthurium, in the genuine lechuza pond with this water mixture has given me really, really beautiful results. I've also found that in this setup, they do pretty well, especially the anthurium, living in my ambient household humidity, which for me is generally between 50 and 65%. Over and over again, especially with anthurium, but I think aroids in general, I hear that they just love water and they love having access to water regularly. I think that a self-watering semi-hydro setup with the genuine lechuza pond and then the correctly balanced and prepared water really gives your plant the best of every single possible situation that they could want in order to really help them thrive and to maintain the health of their leaves and to maintain the health of their roots. Once you have your plant established and it seems to be doing really well in your pond, your regular maintenance is going to be pretty low key, but it is still going to be important to do certain things to keep up with your plant. The main thing is that every 6 weeks or so, it is going to be very important for you to flush the pond under clean water in order to help clear out nutrient buildup and also to continue to flush out as much of those fine rock granules as possible. This is really, really important because the buildup of nutrients in the substrate and in the reservoir is going to make it so that it throws the pH balance of the water off. And once that pH starts to get out of the correct range, either the plant isn't going to be able to uptake the nutrients as efficiently, and so it's not going to get as much bang for your buck of growth from your fertilizer, or it can even start to burn your plant from nutrient buildup. So it's really important that every 6 weeks or so, you continue to flush your plant. One of the key differences between growing your plants in a semi-hydro setup with something like pond as opposed to in soil is that you're going to have to deal with pests a little bit differently. And there are pros and cons to how you go about doing this. The first thing that is really nice with a hydroponics setup is that you don't really have to worry about pests like fungus gnats anywhere near as much as you would if you were continuing to use soil. Other pests that need soil as part of their life cycle are also going to have a much more difficult time establishing themselves in a collection where everything is fully hydroponic. However, that does not mean that you will never have to deal with pests. In fact, it is still very important to treat your plants with systemic pest control if you want to ensure the long-term health of your plants. Also, in a very large collection, if you get a collection-wide outbreak of almost anything, it's really, really difficult and time-consuming and expensive to set everything right again. So in my opinion and experience, it is better to try and head those things off beforehand. There are a number of different systemic products that you can use in a semi-hydroponic setup, but for me, I have found success with a product called Azamax. So what I do and what I have found success with using Azamax is I add Azamax to my hydroponic water with no fertilizer and nothing else added to it, just filtered water and Azamax a few times for a few waterings in the early spring, right around the time when pests start to ramp up. I find if I do this, the actual pests that I end up dealing with is very, very reduced, and it makes managing the little outbreaks that I have here and there, probably from things just coming into my house from outside, extremely manageable. And the nice thing is too, if you treat preventatively, you don't have to actually spray down the foliage of all of your plants. It makes it really easy, but it's really, really important that you do it ahead of time. If you do end up in a situation where your hydroponics plants are infested with some kind of pest such as spider mites or thrips, you still can use the Azamax as a foliage spray, and you absolutely should. And you can still use any other product that is a foliar spray, but unfortunately things like systemic granules are not really made for hydroponics, and so I don't recommend trying to use those. If you want to go ahead and do hydroponics, particularly pond, I highly, highly suggest that you get some Azamax to have on hand just as a preventative and work that application into your plant care schedule. I personally like to do an Azamax application to all my hydroponic plants in early spring, and thus far I've had really good success with it. All right, so that pretty much sums up the basics of getting your plants set up into a hydroponic setup in pond, and some things to keep in mind and some tips and tricks. But of course, no journey in plant care would be complete without talking about results. And I think that the results from using pond are just absolutely unparalleled. I definitely started experimenting using hydroponics and then eventually settling on pond as my preferred method because I really, really wanted to see if I could get the incredible results that I was seeing other people talk about. And I will say that I think I've had some pretty incredible results, especially with growing anthurium. My experience growing anthurium in pond with the water mixture that I outlined earlier and the care tips that I outlined earlier is that they generally tend to pop leaves really soon after putting them into pond, especially if they already had a nice healthy root system going in. Additionally, the leaves get bigger really, really quickly and the plants root like crazy. I would say that the one downside to growing plants in pond, specifically anthurium, is that they grow so quickly that they outgrow their pots much, much faster than plants that you keep in soil. And that can get a little bit expensive and be challenging because it can start to be really difficult to find pots that are big enough, especially for some of the larger species of anthurium. My Anthurium regale is definitely one where I've struggled to continue to find pots that are large enough for it as it's needed to be up potted because those plants get so enormous. But there are some other instances where plants can actually, especially Anthurium, do just fine for a really long time in pots that look way too small. So It's one of those things that you kind of just have to take the situation, you know, as it comes. But overall, if you are thinking about trying self-watering, thinking about trying some semi-hydro, if you are curious about experimenting with pond, I highly, 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 highly recommend that you do try it. But I also highly, highly recommend that you go ahead and get the genuine Lechuza pond and don't try and do a DIY version. And the reasons for that are several, but the primary reason that I would probably say is that getting the ingredients for the DIY pond is difficult because the same brands are not always in stock. And so if you run out of something, you may have to buy a different brand than you ordinarily would have. And the one key difference that I have noticed between the DIY pond and the genuine Lechuza pond is that the granules of the rocks between all of the different ingredients in the genuine pond are very, very uniform in size, and they're very small. The DIY pond that I have made, I've struggled to find all the different ingredients in similar sized granules, and it's just impossible to really replicate the effect of the pond with the airflow without granules that are similar in size. So that's not to say that some people haven't had lots and lots of success with DIY pond. I think it's just a little bit more complicated than maybe people would like to admit. So I personally highly, highly, highly recommend getting the real thing. It will be a little bit challenging. You may have to wait on that website to restock, but it's definitely worth it. I 100% would say that all of the plants that I have in the real genuine Lechuza pond have done much better overall than the plants that I've had in the DIY. So now, please, if you've tried Lechuza pond in the past, please leave your experience down in the comments below. I'm sure there are lots of people who are curious to dip their toe in the water, but just want to get all the information that they possibly can before they try. If you have questions about using pond, go ahead, leave them down in the comments below. If there's additional specific parts of this video you'd like me to further expand upon, let me know, and maybe I'll make another one in the future. That is going to be it for me for today. Thank you so much for chilling with me. I hope that this was helpful, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.